The African Union just made a surprise trip to Burkina Faso. Yes, the same Burkina Faso once dismissed under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership. Today, we are unpacking the diplomatic shockwave that's keeping Western envoys awake at night. The AES Alliance is shaking the foundations of Africa's political order. And now, the AU is knocking on Traoré's door, desperate to stay relevant. Before we continue, a big salute to our loyal subscribers. If you are new here and want the unfiltered truth shaping Africa's future, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. All right, let's dive in. Picture this, the same African Union that suspended Burkina Faso in January of 2022, condemning their military government as illegitimate and threatening complete isolation, suddenly sends their top envoy, Tete Antonio, to Ouagadougou. The same organization that voted to suspend Burkina Faso's participation in all AU activities until the effective restoration of constitutional order. And now talking about listening missions and African solutions to Africa's problems. What changed? Was it the millions of social media views of crowds chanting Africa for Africans when Ibrahim Traoré took power? Or was it something far more strategic and dangerous for the old continental order? The optics couldn't be more telling. Angola's representative, speaking for an institution that has historically rubber-stamped Western interests, suddenly discovering the principle of non-indifference when it comes to a revolution that's inspiring youth across the continent. But here's what they don't want you to know about why this diplomatic U-turn happened when it did, and why the AU is scrambling to stay relevant in a continent that's moving beyond their control. On June 17, 2025, the African Union Special Envoy arrived in Burkina Faso for what they carefully termed a listening mission. That's what I call diplomatic speak for damage control. This wasn't scheduled diplomacy. This was crisis management. Why? Because Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, officially withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2025 and formed the Alliance of Sahel States, creating the most significant challenge to Western-backed regional architecture since independence. The timing reveals everything. While Nigeria was scrambling to host the West African Economic Summit between June 20th and 21, desperately trying to maintain ECOWAS relevance, the AU was making its own play to remain connected to a region that was slipping away. Antonio's mission was crystal clear: understand how three small countries had managed to expose the impotence of both the ECOWAS and the African Union itself. The delegation described their visit as seeking what collective path we can take as Africans to find solutions. But what they discovered in their meeting with Traoré would force the AU to confront an uncomfortable truth about who really speaks for Africa's future. To understand this diplomatic earthquake, we must go back to September of 2022, when a 34-year-old army captain named Ibrahim Traoré led a coup that removed Lieutenant Colonel Henry Damiba, who had seized power just 8 months prior. Unlike the typical African strongman narrative, Traoré's rise deliberately echoed the revolutionary spirit of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's legendary leader, who was assassinated in 1987 for refusing to bow to French neo-colonial pressure. The parallels are striking and intentional. Both men came to power young, both rejected foreign military bases, and both spoke directly to Africa's youth about self-determination. Sankara, known as Africa's Che Guevara, had given Burkina Faso its name, Land of Honest People, eliminated foreign aid, and implemented groundbreaking pro-women policies decades ahead of his time. The completion of Thomas Sankara's museum in May 2025, designed by renowned architect Francis Kéré, symbolically connects Traoré's revolution to Sankara's unfinished vision. But where Sankara faced isolation, Traoré found allies. Mali's Assimi Goïta and Niger's Abdourahmane Tiani joined him in creating the AES, turning three failed states into a confederation that's now controls vast mineral wealth and refuses Western military presence. The African Union, which has spent decades legitimizing leaders who sold their country's resources to former colonizers, suddenly found itself facing a new generation that refused to play by the old rules. Here is the scandal the diplomatic class won't discuss openly. The African Union is losing relevance while a 34-year-old Burkinabe officer rewrites the rules of African sovereignty through concrete economic transformation. While Antonio spoke diplomatically about listening and understanding, the numbers tell a radically different story than what Western media narratives suggest. Burkina Faso's economy has grown at an average annual rate of 6.4% over the last 4 years, with GDP projected to reach $22.7 billion by 2025, making it the 20th largest economy in Africa. The real confrontation isn't about economics, it's about authority and resource control. Traoré's government has nationalized gold reserve, established the country's first domestic gold refinery, and created national gold reserve for the first time in the nation's history. Through the state-owned mining company, Burkina Faso recovered 2 industrial mines and collected over 11 tons of gold in just the first quarter of 2025. When Traoré announced his 2025 territory reconquest deadline, promising to recapture the remaining 30% of the territory from terrorist control after recruiting new army personnel, he wasn't just talking about defeating insurgents. He was declaring that African problems will be solved by African solutions, not French military interventions. The AU's sudden interest stems from a terrifying realization. If the AES model succeeds, it exposes every compromise African leaders have made with neo-colonial powers. The ripple effects of Burkina Faso's revolution are reshaping African geopolitics in real time, and the old guards are scrambling to maintain control. Despite Western media portraying Burkina Faso as the epicenter of global terrorism, the country has launched 25 massive development projects under Traoré's leadership, including tomato processing plants, a modernized airport, and even plans for nuclear power development. International partnerships are multiplying. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belosov held high-level talks with Burkina Faso's defense minister in May of 2025, with Russia describing Burkina Faso as a close, friendly ally and promising enhanced military cooperation. But here's what's really keeping African leaders awake at night. The AES Confederation introduced biometric passports on January 29, 2025, with Traoré himself receiving the first AES passport, symbolically breaking away from ECOWAS infrastructure. These aren't just travel documents. They represent economic integration without Western oversight, facilitating free movement of people, goods, and services within a resource-rich confederation. The Trump administration's USAID funding freeze, which cut about $312 million to Burkina Faso, has backfired spectacularly, with pro-government activists using it as evidence of foreign interference. Nigeria's President Tinubu's desperate invitation to the June Economic Summit, trying to lure AES countries back into ECOWAS, reveals the panic in traditional power circles as the regional bloc faces a 50% reduction in territorial size. What we are witnessing in Burkina Faso is the emergence of a new African consciousness that terrifies both Western capitals and their African proxies, amplified by a sophisticated digital strategy. Traoré's rise has been driven as much by military action as by strategic digital presence, positioning him as a Pan-African symbol of resistance. The AES Confederation represents something unprecedented. African countries choosing African partners over traditional donors, building continental integration from the grassroots rather than through elite-driven institutions. The irony is exquisite. The same African Union that spent decades legitimizing leaders who mortgage their own country's future is now begging for relevance from revolutionaries who refuse to accept the continent's subordinate status. Social media campaigns praising Traoré as the people's captain aren't just viral content. They represent a generation of rejecting the politics of dependence. The viral spread of AES symbolism across Africa isn't mere digital noise. It's the visual language of a new Pan-Africanism that bypasses traditional institutions entirely. The question facing every African today isn't whether Traoré's revolution will succeed. It's whether we'll have the courage to demand the same level of sovereignty from our own leaders. When a 34-year-old soldier can expose the weaknesses of institutions that have governed Africa for decades, and when 3 small countries can force continental powers to come begging for dialogue, it reveals something profound about the moment we are living in. The AU's visit to Burkina Faso wasn't just diplomacy. It was an admission that the old order is crumbling and new forces are rising. But here's what every African watching this must understand. Revolutions aren't exported, they are inspired. The youth celebrating Traoré from Lagos to Nairobi aren't just admiring his defiance, they are recognizing their own potential to transform their own countries. Here's what I need you to think about. If Burkina Faso can nationalize its gold mines and build its own refinery while maintaining economic growth, why can't your country do the same with its own resources? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know which African country you think will be the next to follow the Burkina Faso's model. The mainstream media will continue to portray Africa through the lens of crisis and dependence, but we who live this reality know better. We are witnessing the birth of a new Africa, one that refuses to apologize for choosing its own path. The Sahel region is becoming the epicenter of African Renaissance under youth leadership. The Thomas Sankara Museum, now standing in Ouagadougou, isn't just honoring the past, it's declaring that his dream of genuine African independence is finally being realized. Second question for you, do you believe the African Union can reform itself to become truly relevant to Africa's youth, or is it destined to become another colonial relic? Let me know in the comments what you think the AU needs to do to regain credibility with our generation. The only question that remains is whether you will be a spectator or a participant in this historic transformation. This is Frontline Africa. If you value truth unfiltered and power reframed from an African lens, subscribe, like, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I am Ezekiel Enejeta. See you in the next one.